So yeah, my name is Russell Skaggs, and I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit today about accessibility within React. First off, I kind of want to thank the people that are here this morning. I think since this pandemic kind of took fold, and I'm actually working out of my house, it's rare that I'm awake before 8:30. The 5-minute commute is real nice, but I also want to take a quick moment to thank all the sponsors of Code PaLOusa that are making this virtual event possible, despite some hiccups that we would all like to be there in person. I think it's especially great when sponsors will do these sorts of virtual events because they don't even have like the booths in the hallways to try to poach one another's employees. But yeah, a little bit about myself. I am a front-end developer. I've been working in front-end development for about 10 years now. Primarily, I actually fall more on the HTML, CSS side of things. But over the last couple years, I have really gotten to know and love React, especially in context of accessibility in HTML in the same way that I had previously gotten to know and love Sass in terms of CSS. But before we dive too much into React, I think we need to really take a look at accessibility in general. And when we talk about accessibility, what we really mean is that websites, tools, and technologies are developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And this isn't despite the modern focus on accessibility, this isn't really a new principle. In particular, we want people with disabilities to be able to perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web. And we also want people with disabilities to be able to contribute to the web. And as I was saying, like this accessibility, it's kind of a broader issue than a lot of times it gets focused on. It's much more than just alt tags and color contrast. Accessibility covers a range of disabilities, including auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual. And like I was saying before, this isn't really a new concept, despite the heavy focus on it as of late due to lawsuits. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, the reason that we are able to go to work every day and get nice, cushy tech jobs, has stated that the power of the web is in its universality, and access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. So the W3C put together this web accessibility initiative, and it focuses on 4 key principles. A web experience needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. When we talk about perceivable, what we're really meaning is that we need text alternatives for non-text content, captions and other alternatives for multimedia. Content can be presented in different ways, and content is easier to see and hear. In regards to operable, we need to make sure that the site has functionality available just from the keyboard. We need to know that users have enough time to read and use the content. The content cannot cause seizures, physical reactions. Users can easily navigate, find content, and determine where they are. And users can use different input modalities beyond keyboard. And for understandable, we need to make sure that the text is readable and understandable. We want to make sure content appears and operates in predictable ways. And users should be helped to avoid and correct any mistakes that they come across or that they're encountering. When it comes to being robust, the big rule is that your site needs to be compatible with the current and future user tools. Now, those are some pretty vague standards, just taken at their face. But the Web Accessibility Initiative has gone farther to publish some web content accessibility guidelines. In those guidelines, they map all of the measurable criteria to aligning to those 4 high-level principles to single A, double A, or triple A compliance. If you are new to the Wcag compliance rules, you might be wondering like why we don't necessarily shoot for gold, but more or less, when looking at these, like it's kind of agreed that single A is the bare minimum you can do to kind of reach a broader audience. And on the other side, the AAA is almost impossible to actually achieve because some content can't be developed on the web currently to meet some of those AAA standards. So generally speaking, most companies kind of go for that AA standard. And while I can't, I'm not a lawyer and can't give legal advice, that's also where a lot of people have been advised from accessibility firms and their own legal teams to try to strive for. All right. So when we think about this, I think it's important to look at all of those principles and understand that accessibility must be considered at all stages of the site or app, even before developers begin to code. I know in my experience, and it happens a lot when I join a new team, that sort of accessibility task is treated like something that is a code problem, and a lot of times things will come to me that are already problematic. For instance, color contrast being one of the big ones. No amount of coding I can do can suddenly make 2 incompatible colors pass AA compliance. Similarly, making sure that the content is readable and understandable is something that the content team needs to work on before passing it off to development. But why am I telling you guys this, or why am I telling you all this? I'm assuming most people here are developers, and that's the reason I'm emphasizing this is just because we have to, as a development community, be making sure that we're pulling people into that conversation so that folks get considered much earlier than an edge case or an afterthought. All right, but on the other side, there are some things that we absolutely can control. Along with the Wcag guidelines, the Web Accessibility Initiative also kind of drafted this ARIA spec, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. The standard for ARIA is to help make sites more accessible for assistive technologies, especially those sites with more interactive components. So ARIA has kind of 2 main principles. The first one is acknowledging that when you assign a role to something using this ARIA spec, that it's a promise. And when you take on that promise, you are telling the assistive technology that you have taken the time to add in all the JavaScript necessary to meet those requirements and expectations. The other big role, or the other big principle, is that ARIA can both cloak and enhance, creating both power and danger. For example, one of the ARIA attributes being ARIA hidden can be used to completely cut off content from screen readers. Sometimes that's intentional. And maybe it's one of those situations where you're hiding it visually from your sighted users, but not using display none because of animation needs. So similarly, you would want to hide that for non-sighted users. But you just need to take real care that you don't accidentally ruin someone's experience or honestly violate their rights. And with those two principles in mind, it's no wonder that one of the first things that the ARIA spec says is that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And generally speaking, semantic HTML should kind of be your default go-to strategy for building an accessible site to begin with. Okay, so I've taken the time to kind of do a 10-minute crash course into accessibility. Not all inclusive, lots more out there. But you may be wondering, like, what does any of this have to do with React? And honestly, very little. But one of the things I've noticed, especially more so probably last year and the years prior, is that React had a bit of a reputation problem. There were a lot of folks that were more like me, heavier involved with the HTML, CSS side of front-end development, that kind of cast this idea that React was somehow bad for accessibility. And there may be a reason for that. When WebAIM ran an evaluation of the 1 million most popular websites on the internet, it did break down and identify like what frameworks were used on those sites. Now, I think it's clear looking at this chart that we can all agree that clearly MooTools is the best JavaScript library for accessibility. Like, the numbers don't lie, and all those Vue people better be apologizing because clearly it's the worst. But we know it's more complicated than that. When you look at the top 3 libraries, those have been out for a long time. So it's very likely that maybe some of those sites have just been more mature. And even regardless of why this breakdown is, we can know, even by just looking at some of these things, that Require.js has nothing to do with accessibility. That is just a package loader. But you don't really need to take my word for it. There's a much smarter person who's spoken on this already, and that is Mark Stedman of DQ. Of the people that are here watching this that are already interested in accessibility, that name may pop up, because DQ is one of the most respected firms when it comes to accessibility audits and testing. They created the very popular accessibility testing tool, Axe. And Mark wrote a whole article debunking this myth. But I think it was best summarized with the stigma that React is not an accessible framework is simply not true. It has some of the best built-in accessibility functionality out there, or there is out there, and a large community of accessibility advocates that are creating content that is easily consumable within your application. So if it's not the tool's fault, I had to think about, like, well, what might be causing some of this bad perception in React? and more accurately, like the bad data that showed that of the most popular sites, ones that had React were below average when it came to accessibility testing. Well, also about a year ago, Chris Corrier of CSS Tricks kind of wrote this interesting article about the Great Divide in front end. And he started to kind of shift these kind of two schools of thought into like two sub-branches, two subspecialties. One being more JavaScript engineers who focus a lot on data structure, JavaScript architecture, performance. A lot of them may have even come from more traditional back-end engineering or full stack backgrounds. And the other side being more like UX engineers, people that are more concerned about semantic markup, visual and interaction design, accessibility, design systems. And when I look at the things that he had kind of identified as in each category, it kind of struck me that a lot of the things that were more in the JavaScript camp were more quantifiable, and the things on the UX engineer side were more qualitative. And I can't deny that React can be a bit complicated. It's very data heavy. So it could be a mix of UX engineers being not as comfortable within that ecosystem, as well as JavaScript engineers just generally not liking the not so measurable parts of accessibility. But what if it's also a bit to blame with component-based architecture? All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the code. All right, so we're going to pretend that we were given this awesome design by an awesome designer, and everything here was intentional. One of the big important features, or one of the big important things to do with accessibility is follow semantic markup. But you know, when you're building out components, sometimes it's easy to look at those things in isolation. For instance, on the home page right now, we can see a clear delineation between kind of our heading 1, our heading 2, and a heading 3. And then we also have a button. In our detail page, which is kind of just laying out some of the example components, we can see that the designer made the choice to actually start this page visually with more of a heading style too. So when we start looking at the markup, we start to run into problems with unsemantic markup right off the bat. So when I was first diving into React, one of the things that I was kind of taught very heavily was that you wanted to be very careful with what you pass through. You didn't want to accidentally interfere or clash with anything. But when you're building a component-based architecture, you have to step back and really evaluate how your accessibility is being measured. And your accessibility isn't really being measured on a component-to-component basis. Sure, you may be able to validate things like the color contrast to some extent if you know for certain that it will never show up in a different non-compliant way. But the things that really matter are that integration point. Things like semantic markup, things like whether or not that button component should be a button tag or a link tag is something that can only be determined by the person who is integrating it into the project. So let's take a look at our headings and our 2 pages. So right now, we're just pulling in the heading styles as defined as base level components. And when we look at the code that's getting exported, it's very simple. It's just a basic HTML tag that's accepting the children content and then shoving it back out onto the page. But if I wrote this as a component library and packaged it off, I'm not being a really great accessibility partner. For one, I've not given them any opportunity to update what element is being shown up. But also, we talked earlier about ARIA. What if things that are needed to be integrated properly within the site would be a different ARIA role or a different ARIA attribute? What if one of these headings needed to act as a label? Well, that requires a little bit different mindset. So the first thing is, the first thing we want to do is kind of align this to being able to have semantic markup. So that's honestly pretty simple. We can just add a new property here, and we can default it to the tag we expect it to be. And now, knowing that we're already going to want to account for properties that will be passed that we may not have context for, we're going to go ahead and just grab the rest of the props. So by the way, because of the breakout of this tech conference, I don't know necessarily what people's familiarity is with JavaScript versus HTML, CSS. So if there are any questions regarding coding styles, anything I'm doing, please post them in the chat. I'll try to look in there periodically. So right now, I'm using the the rest operator to grab the rest of the properties that would be passed into this props object. And then I'm going to spread them out onto this heading 1. And because in React, even though it gives you a special place for it, children are just another property, we're even going to just get rid of children and kind of make this a bit of a single closing tag. So now, when we go back to this page, very important thing, the code still renders. So that's definitely a win. And now we're going to do it for the other 3 headers as well. All right. So going back over here, things are still showing up. We haven't completely broken it. So now on the About page, we're going to go through and modify these elements so that we can tell it what element we actually want it to render as. And I'm choosing to make these divs since the purpose of these is to not convey information, but just to showcase the style visually. And then we'll go ahead and leave these as heading 3s down here. All right. So now, when we inspect this page, we can see that this heading 2 style is now being properly applied to a heading 1. Similarly, the heading 2 or the heading 3 style to a heading 2, and these 3 are now properly divs. So that was a quick, easy win from something as from the perspective of someone that would do a lot of work like what I do to build components for other teams to use, empowering them to do the right thing. But that's not the only area that we've currently got issues. In fact, like, let's just take a look at Axe right now. For instance, looking at these pages, neither one of them have titles. That's problematic. You know, one of the things that's kind of easy to do, especially if you're just kind of working inside of a React application, is to forget some of the very basic, simple head stuff that would be obvious if you're actually looking at the document properly. There are a couple different ways to do things like setting the page title. At the very bare bones of React, we could do something like this and pull in the use effect hook from React. And when this about page renders, we can go in and just set the document.title to equal about page. And so now when we run this, we don't get that title error on this page, and we can see the about page up here. But that's not like a really obvious or very React way to kind of manage this. Another way to go about this would be using another third-party NPM package. For me, this example is built on top of Next.js. So I have the benefit of using a built-in tool called NextHead. There's another third-party package out there that isn't really tied to any particular JavaScript single-page application building tool, and that is surprisingly Helmet, a library called Helmet. And I say surprisingly because I found it interesting that it is a library that was written, published, and maintained by the NFL. But like I said, we are using Next.js, so we'll just go ahead and import head from Next head, and just to distinguish that a little bit, and we'll get rid of this use effect. And here we can see the title showing up. So understanding what page that you're on is a really important thing for users using assistive technologies. These tools are pretty awesome to be able to modify the headspace of like a React single page application. Anytime that you would have a conflict with like a matching meta tag ID or a title, the newer component or the deepest component would win. Yeah. So even though it wasn't flagged as an error down here, another thing that we should probably take a look at is that this View More button that takes us to the About page is actually a button, which would give confusing information to an end user, even though Axe didn't necessarily flag it. So let's take another look at that button. Well, we kind of got some of the same problems going on that we had with the header. Whoever wrote this, and of course it was me, and it was me even when I did this the first time writing these components and making mistakes before, made the mistake of just a button is a button, ship it. But the design team wants to be able to use those same buttons for links. So we could implement a similar position that we did with the other elements, but buttons are a little bit more unique. And when we're using them, we almost always want them to either be a button or a link. So rather than passing the exact element we need, we can go down here, create the class, and instead of checking for something the user defined manually, we can just do something as simple as checking whether the href exists. And if it is, give an anchor. If it isn't, return it as a button. And then we're already spreading the props. So now going back into this index, we can get rid of this weird on-click and just make it an href directly. Oh, well, that's not good. All right. If href all right, I'm gonna have to take a look at that later, and maybe by the time we move on, I can figure out why that's not working, despite me doing practice runs where it very clearly did. Or I could just go up here and, what did I miss? All right, so I'm not going to waste any more time on that. I've done this 100 times in production. You should be able to query based off of whether or not the href property is passed, and then if it is, change it to a link. But since that's not working here because it's live, I will move on to a bigger thing. cool. So let's go ahead and do the same over here. And it's dealing with the same problem. So clearly I messed something up with the component. That's okay. But running through the Axe tools, there's some other errors that we've had that popped up. The first one being that documents must have one main landmark. So that's one of those things that's looking at the individual page. Oh yeah, when I integrated it, I added it incorrectly here, but in the nest of HTML tags and partials and pages, I must have forgotten to integrate it here. So we'll go through and add the main tag. And this should clean up all of these pages. Oh, this error is showing because of this indicator for the dev tools for running Next.js local. Now that I've dismissed it, if I run it again, we'll see that I am error-free. We'll just pretend about that. We'll just pretend not to notice that link that's still being rendered as a button. But one thing that's important to understand about these tools is that automated testing coverage can find about half of all accessibility issues. And just because I managed to fix what Axe is showing me doesn't mean that I can have the confidence to go forward knowing that my stuff is working and accessible. It takes a round of manual testing. And as developers, I would encourage everyone to get more familiar with assistive technologies that you can, especially like VoiceOver, JAWS, or any other screen reader that you can get without breaking the bank, or you can get your company to pay for. If for no other reason, I think it's a good exercise to every once in a while kind of look away from the monitor, try to navigate the site just based on what you're hearing in your keyboard interactions. And that's not to say that simulates a real experience of a native assistive technology user, but it does kind of give you a little bit of the insight into some of the problems that they may face. I will always advocate when possible bringing on a QA person that is a native user of assistive technologies. They use it as their primary way of operating on the web. It's going to make your stuff better. And it's also one of those situations where you can make your experience more bulletproof, more accessible, and also provide some employment opportunities to sometimes a very marginalized group of people. But we had someone run through the audit. We had someone run through this page. And one of the things that they told me is that the tabs weren't accessible. And to which me, being a developer, went through with my keyboard and just tab. The focus works, the focus works, the focus works, focus works. What do you mean they're not accessible? Well, that's where some of those ARIA things pop in. Tabs, despite being like a very common thing on the web, it's still a more rich, interactive UI piece. And when we look at the semantic structure of these tabs, there's nothing that I have done to communicate to any assistive technologies that these two pieces of code have any relationship to one another. And this is probably one of those things that I was most guilty of earlier in my career, just writing basic jQuery stuff. So we've accepted the fact that there is an issue, and ARIA provides a good solution to a lot of these problems. Beyond the principles that they establish on their one page, they also, which is this page, it seems like, nope, I'm just being silly. It is this page that I wanted to go to. They also offer these design patterns that have kind of defined like what the defined experience should be for these various roles. And the documentation here is really solid, really thorough. It's also not super scannable. But what is super scannable is their examples. But before we move on to the examples, whenever W3C puts a note box, especially regarding accessibility, I think it's worth taking a look at. And this recommendation is to have tabs automatically switch as long as when they have tabs automatically activate whenever they receive focus, which is something that I would not have known and honestly did not know before I decided to use tabs in this example for this talk. So we will look at the tabs with automatic activation as an example. So when we go here, we can tab through the content and we can kind of see that none of the tabs are being tabbed to when you tab. And if we are focused on the tab and we use our arrow keys, it navigates the tabs per the ARIA spec. I'm really fond of using these examples for reference because everything just seems a little bit better laid out, more white space, easier to scan through. And here it kind of gives us a key of the sort of things we need to copy into our tabs. So let's open up the tabs component. The first thing that we're noticing is we're actually missing a ARIA label on here at all. So let's go down to tabs. And for the tab, oh, apparently I did add the role of tablet. That's cheater code. We're not going to look at that. Not going to look at that. Yeah, going down here to the tabs. And on the tab list, I haven't actually properly identified the role. So we'll add that as tab list. And we are supposed to give this a label. So we'll just pass the ARIA label along that we used when we integrate the page. So pass in a label of schedule. So down here, we can see those things getting passed. There we go. Oh, all right. Cool. The next thing that we can take a look at this sort of table that we're missing is determining both what I'll say is the next most important thing is kind of giving this ARIA controls some context. So at a high level, we're using some complicated use reducer stuff to keep track of it so that we, when we integrate it on the page, we can make sure that the right tabs load in the right order and whatnot. But part of adding that into that array is that we added a kind of unique ID to the tabs when we created the tab panel on the page down here. So we can tie into the tab panel and just pass this tab ID down here as tab ID panel, and while we're down here, we will go ahead and label it All right, then up here, when we're pulling in the button, we have access to this ID as we're looping through each of the tabs. So we'll just go down here and we'll give this an ID of ID tab and ARIA controlled, or ARIA controls. And since we're here, we'll also go ahead and give this a role of tab, and this down here a role of tab. Refresh this page, and now we have these linking up so that an assistive, a screen reader would know that via the ARIA controls property that this button will impact this tab. So one of the next things we need to do is actually get it so that only the tab that is active is one that can be tabbable. So for styling reasons, we already had kind of an is active Boolean. So we'll just do tab index, and we'll check is active. And if it is, we'll return 0. And if it isn't, we'll return -1. Also, we just have ARIA selected set to is active. So now, when I tab through, it'll skip the rest of the tabs. Now, it jumped down to the button underneath that in that tab panel, which also isn't correct. So we're going to want to go down here and give this item a similar treatment. So is active 0, else -1. I honestly could have only had it showing up 0 if it was active, but applying the -1 doesn't really hurt anything. So now, if I tab from the tab, it'll actually focus on this content container per the best practices established by ARIA. Now, so I believe we've got all of the labeling set aside, but a role is a promise, and we're still breaking the promise that we made when we assigned that role. And that is that when I go here, if I click the arrow buttons, nothing happens. So in a sense, I've made the application worse if I were to just walk away from it right here. So there are a few ways to go about integrating this sort of like making it go to the next tab. And this is one of those areas where I think that React handles accessibility really well. When you start getting down the functional React rabbit hole, you start becoming more comfortable with declarative programming and not so much about go and update everything that you're going to touch, but just update those values that matter, and the application will take care of the rest, similar to what we're doing with isActive. We don't need to go and manually turn every panel on or off. We just need to know whether or not that thing is active. So I could, looking at like the options available to us, I could just do an on key up and fire that logic inside of the button itself. But this is probably not the most pure way to handle reducers. But I actually like the idea of being able to just dispatch an event that says go to next. So I'm going to make another sort of resolve action type function. If anyone on here is familiar with like the Redux use reducer pattern, and you're wondering why I'm using like an object syntax instead of switches, that's just personal coding style, because I think switches are the devil. So we're going to set next tab. But also, what do I know? Apparently, I can't even make a button a link. So what we'll want to do is grab, we want to do actually just exactly this. We'll break apart the state, we'll deconstruct it into tab list and active tab ID, and then we will grab the active tab index by going tab list dot find index. Right, so this should return the position that it exists within the array. And if it doesn't, it'll return -1. So next, I'll just go ahead and make one for next active tab. And we'll just check whether this tab index is less than tab list dot length -1. And if it is, we're going to make that next tab just be the tab list with the next logical tab. And if not, we're going to loop right back around to 0. And we're going to return this update state function, which is just a helper function to run through the object.assign up here, so that I don't have to repeat object.assign empty object state and then the update object all the time. Active tab ID equals next active tab. All right, so now whenever this set next active tab is dispatched, or set next tab is dispatched, the tab should update. Okay, so let's go down here and now make a handler for key up. I am going to deconstruct the event object because the only thing I care about is event.key. So we'll deconstruct it and grab key. And we'll also do a sort of resolve object. By the way, I'm terrible with like terminology. So if anyone has like an industry standard version of what people call these like switches that aren't switches, feel free to put it in chat. And while I'm typing this out, part of the reason that I don't like switches has more to do with the lets and consts within ES6 and newer. With like things like if statements, those get block scope within the between the curly brackets, but that doesn't exist between case and break, so you can't get proper block scoping. So that's a personal gripe that I could probably get over, but I don't have to because the object way works just fine. And then we're going to run this. And if resolve key, resolve key. And I know I'm a horrible person for not actually wrapping that in an if statement. And we'll go down and do an on key up and handle key up. Hopefully this time, unlike all of my demos, I won't have forgotten something. And when we get to Wednesday, resolve key is not defined. So yeah, resolve key, not relove key. When we get down to Wednesday and I hit the arrow, it breaks. And that is because I was silly and I identified the next tab, but I did not properly identify that it's the ID property that I need. So none of the tabs were active and therefore everything hid. So now when I hit the arrow key, all right, we're looping. One thing you'll probably notice is that the Wednesday stays underlined. This is a problem because we are not properly managing focus. So a cited or a non-cited user would be wondering like why that control still says Wednesday. All right, so we'll go through here real quick and make another couple additions to the tab button. So we'll add a couple useref statements. We're going to put this one to tie into the button element itself, and then we're also going to tie into lifecycle hook. So I'll continue my bad practices. If is initialized dot current and button elm and is active and button elm dot focus. And then we only need to run this whenever is active changes. And we will want to pass this ref down here. So when you do this with React, it gives you access to the DOM element itself. So the reason that I had to add that is initiated is because if I hadn't done that, when the tabs load onto the page and do their first render, they would automatically focus and not take you to where you would expect to be, causing a whole different accessibility issue. So yeah, let's go ahead and tab on this page. And now we hit Wednesday. And we're hitting the arrow key, and it's still not working. So am I in the right spot? Yes. Ref, button elm. Oh, yes, button elm.current. Now we'll do it again. Once again, really strange that isn't focusing. Let's try getting rid of this condition. All right, well, basically the goal is to refocus that button. Once again, live, not entirely sure why it's not working. This was not even one of the problems I ran into dry running this. But we will go ahead and copy this next item, or we will go ahead and copy this set next tab to set prev. We'll pretend like we updated these to more semantically correct JavaScript variable names. But for now, we'll just actually check if it's greater than 0, -1, else tablets.length -1. So just kind of flipping the script on the reverse pattern. And then down here, we'll just copy this, check for left, and now when we go through here, we can go through here backwards. So I know that I know that I went over by about 3 minutes, I believe, to what we were supposed to. Does anyone have any questions about any of the things that I covered, other than why did 2 of the examples of me messing with buttons fail to work? All right. So I will try to figure out what I did wrong here. And I don't know if there's a good way to correct any of this, but I'll try to make sure that I publish this Git repo with before and after code that I did during this live demo. I'll probably make comments and try to make comments of where my mistakes were and how I remedied them. Otherwise, I do want to thank you guys for tuning in, especially being so early comparatively for a conference session, especially being a digital conference session. I appreciate you guys kind of the desire to come and learn about accessibility. And just once again, I'd like to thank the sponsors for helping make this Code PaLOusa possible. So just throw that back up there and we'll hide the keyboard. All right. I'll probably stick around till about 9:40 if anyone has any questions. I mean, I guess I can't really go anywhere anyway. Very welcome. Oh, I'm aware. I normally don't live code, but I felt that like this is one of those topics that when I tried to just do it with PowerPoint with like slides, it didn't feel quite right. So rolled the dice. Thank you. Oh, for the 3 people still here, I forgot to actually set this current equal to true. So I never actually bothered initiating it. Yeah, so there's changing focus, right? And here is the reason that it didn't work over here is I had opened the wrong button component. All right. I appreciate the 3 people, or the 2 people that saw me fix those 2 bugs. Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be back at, I think, 11, whenever the 11-ish talk starts to talk about data management in React, where I'll be live coding again, and I can assure you there will be more mistakes made. Thanks, everyone. Bye.